Hi, folks. Thank you for watching. And my guest for this next hour, 2 hours, however long we end up talking about this, is my buddy Dan from the channel The Magic Theater, where he does really awesome media analysis and critique of movies and TV shows. And we're going to talk about Star Trek and maybe a little Superman if we get there. Before we get too far into things, I'll just say, welcome, Dan. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this was all your idea, so I'm
yeah. Well, basically, I know that because the two sort of main media things you like to talk about most on your channel is in this order: Star Trek and Superman.
I do talk about Star Trek and Superman a lot. Yeah,
these are both properties that I'm a fan of, but not as much of a fan of as you. I'm a bit of a step back, I guess, from your sort of engagement with it. I like these properties, but more just in sort of the way I like lots of things. You know, I wouldn't put them necessarily above anything. But so I thought it might be interesting for your subscribers, for me to talk about my film industry insider kind of perspective on how Star Trek and Superman have been viewed within the film industry specifically. So not the TV industry, which I don't really know much about. I've never worked in TV. I think I did a thing for like a week, but beyond that, I know very little about the insider machinations of that. But I have been had my ear to film industry gossip for since 2000 or so. So you hear lots of little things, bits and pieces about all these different franchises, and the Star Trek franchise has had a very rocky image within the film industry for a lot of reasons that have and the image that the film industry has had of these films. I'm talking mainly about the original series films, but also, we'll talk about all the different eras, but and about how the sort of the way that it was at Paramount was the studio behind the movies, the way that they handled the franchise and the way that sort of alienated a lot of people in the film industry, and that like a lot of directors didn't want to have anything to do with it, kind of thing. And I guess the key to it is that the original series films were made in sort of a different era of relationship between the film industry and the TV industry. At that time, TV was really kind of looked down upon by film industry professionals for sort of three reasons. Basically, because the budgets were really low. The writing was often quite poor and done really fast. Like they would often shoot first drafts, with a little bit of tweaks here and there, but mostly just like revised first drafts. And the filmmaking was often done in the most sort of simplistic ways, I guess. And so from a film like director and writer's perspective, it was like there wasn't a lot attractive about working in TV. And a lot of people who worked in TV desperately wanted to get out of working in TV and work in film, sort of thing. And of course, now the situation is very, very different. It's basically the other way around. These days, a lot of film people are really desperate to get into working on, I guess TV is not the right word anymore, more shows because of the old Netflix thing. And, but a lot of film people want to make shows because they want to tell longer stories with more character development. There's a pretty hard limit on how much you can do in character development terms in a movie. Like, for example, Walter White in Breaking Bad, you can never do that character in a movie series. There's just no real, even in like 10 films, you probably wouldn't have enough time to develop that character as well as they developed it in the show. So it's a very different situation now. But yeah, so I thought we might as well just start at the start.
Well,
go ahead.
I wanted, because that was the subject that you pitched when you emailed me about this, and the perception of Star Trek in the movie industry. And it's one of the few franchises that you could really talk about and draw like meaningful distinctions because it has existed so extensively in both sides. There have been, at this point, I think 13 Star Trek films. Plus, it's always been primarily perceived as a TV property, but nonetheless, it has all these movies, some of which have been fairly successful, some of which haven't been.
And with the whole second movie curse thing, was it every even odd numbered movie? With that whole thing, it's sort of taken on its own little sort of subculture within Star Trek as well, I guess.
And I know for Star Trek fans like myself, even even those of us who have very warm feelings towards some of the films, we always sort of think, well, it's more of a TV thing. And we get more excited about the prospect of a new Star Trek TV show than we do about the prospect of a new Star Trek movie.
Right.
So do you want? Go ahead and let's talk about how the movie business sort of perceived Star Trek.
Well, yeah. So I guess it all starts with the motion picture, and I think the key to that one is that how it started. It's when it was first being discussed. There was actually a TV show. What do they? I think what was the?
It was Phase 2.
Phase 2. That was yeah, and then it sort of morphed into a movie somehow, and I guess that is the key to the problems with the movie because it was kind of doomed from the screenplay stage onwards because it was just a TV pilot that was extended out into a movie, without a whole lot of extra detail being added. So there has the sort of perception within Star Trek fandom of being slow and boring for a good reason because not very much happens in it. It would have been quite a jam-packed episode of a TV show, but not so much a movie. But regardless of the problems with the screenplay and the studio sort of interference with the screenplay, they did choose a really good director for that one, Robert Wise.
Oh yeah,
he's got a massively good reputation in the film industry. His filmography is really strong. And before he was a director, he was an editor, and he edited Citizen Kane. So this is a guy who he's been working as a director since the 40s. This is a guy who the film industry was delighted when he was chosen because it's a strong indication that they cared a lot about this film franchise. However, he came away from that project really having had a terrible experience with studio interference that was regarded as pretty much massive and all encompassing, and also the fact that he had this screenplay with a lot happening in it. He didn't have what is called script control in the industry. He didn't really have a say over changes to the screenplay. I mean, within reason, but not very much. So he didn't have a great experience, and his talking about his experience with other filmmakers afterwards was not glowing, to say the least.
Yeah, well, and I think Roddenberry had more control on that picture too. I think that was
right
after the motion picture. The studio kind of took it away from Roddenberry. Yeah.
I think he had a thing where they would send him the screenplays and he would give them the thumbs up or the thumbs down. And they did do a rewrite on one of the movies because he gave it the thumbs down. But still, I mean, he wasn't the only one. We'll get to that later, though. Right. So that's motion picture. It was a promising start. But things sort of started slowly getting worse after that. With Nicholas Meyer, he was a younger director. And when I say young, I don't mean his age. I don't know what his age was, but in terms of like the amount of movies he directed, basically. He'd only had one feature under his belt by the time they gave him Wrath of Khan. But it was a good movie. It was a sci-fi movie, which was like a love letter to H.G. Wells. It was pretty well regarded by critics. But the choice of someone of a young director like that is usually an indication in a franchise that the studio wants to control them. They want to be able to have influence over them because they're sort of might be a bit naive about the industry. And his previous film was not a big studio movie. So, I think they wanted to basically have someone they could influence easily. Someone who was not as headstrong and a dominant force in the industry like Robert Wise was, kind of thing. So, I mean, it was a good film, though. He did a good job on it.
And that it's interesting to hear you talk about how maybe he was chosen in part because the studio felt he would be easier to control. I never really thought about that before, but because he was very young in his career at that point, and yet he, at least in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of my fellow hardcore Star Trek fans, he's of all the directors of the films, he's our favorite.
Right.
He also played a role. He co-wrote Star Trek 4 several years later. Right. So he's played, and then he co-wrote and directed Star Trek 6. So he's had a hand in some of the favored films in that franchise.
And I remember you saying in a video that you thought it was an important factor that he didn't really have too much investment in the stories and characters of the show. Like he wasn't a big fan. He was just doing it like it was a job to him, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that was really important because he didn't take fan service into account really. And he didn't come at it as, oh, this is something I've loved since I was 12 years old, and now I have to do something. He was just looking at it as, okay, here are the characters, here's the story, here's what I like to do, here's what I'm good at. Let's just do this. And I remember he wrote an introduction to a collection of Star Trek comic books that I read some years ago, where he talked about how he described his relationship to Star Trek in comparison, or sort of paralleled it with Arthur Conan Doyle's relationship with Sherlock Holmes. And Nick Meyer is also a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. And he said that, Conan Doyle, of course, created Sherlock Holmes, but he got to a point where he didn't really like writing about Sherlock Holmes wasn't his favorite thing. And he did it because people wanted him to, and because it was lucrative, but he kind of eventually reached a sort of distance between the character and himself, where he didn't feel as close to it as he once did. And that's sort of how Nicholas Meyer felt about Star Trek, where he's like, yeah, I like doing this. I'm willing to do this, but it's not like my heart and soul. And I think that actually was to the benefit of his movies.
I agree with that, but I think there's an important sort of proviso to have in there, which is that he was at the same time respectful towards what he was working with. He didn't have characters doing things they wouldn't do or something like that. He listened when it came to people who knew more about the property than him. He took their opinions to heart. He didn't have the sort of stuff that, because later on in the original series films, some of the characters started acting in ways that they might not necessarily should be acting, and definitely that happened in the Next Generation films a lot as well. And so I think that those two things were really important.
Yeah, he was respectful, but he wasn't reverent, I think is a good way to put that. Like he was respectful to the characters, but he wasn't so devoted to how they had been on the show that he refused to make changes.
He was sicking and guessing himself a lot and all that kind of. He wasn't doing that. Yeah, I agree. So then the next one is The Search for Spock. And on this one, so there's a thing in the film industry that is looked down upon that the TV people do, which is having your cast start directing episodes of the TV show. That happens a lot in TV, and I can kind of understand it because they know the characters really well. They've worked on it for years, kind of thing. But from a film industry perspective, that's not great. That's like a deeply television thing to do. But having said that, Spock wasn't actually in the movie very much. So Nimoy wasn't having to do double duty very much as actor and director. So he was able, because was that his first feature film that he directed?
That was his first feature. Yeah. Yeah. He directed some TV before that.
So, he was able to sort of only to not constantly be changing hats kind of thing. So that was good. And it also, was quite, I think he did a fairly good job directing that film. It had some screenplay problems, I think, that movie, but he did a fairly solid job for a debut film. Having said that, though, the fact that it was his very first film really solidified the idea that that Paramount wants to control the directors of these movies, because that when you get someone who's never directed a movie before to jump straight into doing, I think it was probably mid-tier budget, but it was still, there's a lot of money, and it really shows that you're doing that because you're controlling them,
Yeah. And for a Star Trek movie, it was fairly highly anticipated. I mean, because it was coming as a sequel to Part 2, which had been really well regarded and very successful, and they're giving Part 3, which is now all of a sudden a sort of a hotter property than it might otherwise have been, and they're letting the guy who played Spock, who's never directed a movie before, direct it.
So that was not so. I guess a lot of these films, they've had different perceptions before they came out and after. So the perception of the motion picture before it came out was good, after it came out not so good, and it was the other way around, I guess, with Search for Spock. The perception before that movie came out was really bad, and then after it was like, he actually wasn't in the movie very much, so that wasn't too bad, and he actually did a decent job of it for a first-time director. So and then we get to the Voyage home, so Nimoy doing directorship again on that film. There was a loud groan from the film industry when it was learned that he was doing another. They were having an actor do another one. But then it was kind of through the grapevine learned that the studio was actually backing off a lot on this one and letting Nimoy do more what he wanted to, and so he had control of the script on that film. And I don't know whether he had final cut or not on the edit, but he was able to have a lot of influence over the screenplay. Spock's character was heavily in the movie, so that was a bit, Having said that, though, he was a little bit more experienced as a director now, so more able to do that hat changing thing. And then after the film came out, it was lauded. It was viewed as really interesting and sort of daring story, brave. And it was, of course, the highest grossing Trek film until 2009. So, the film industry... Sorry, go on.
Well, I think, it was the reason why people liked it. I think, and the reason it was the biggest, I think, crossover success that Star Trek had until arguably the more recent ones, the JJ Abrams ones that made a pile of money at the box office. But I think it was because it was such a radical departure from the series that you didn't have to know anything about Star Trek to watch it and enjoy it.
Right.
It was just, they're from the future. They're coming back in time. They have to find some whales for some reason. And it's mostly just like a romp, just a fun sort of comedy adventure movie. And, it was
a very self-contained story. Yeah. Because a lot of the other original series films were referencing past films. Like, obviously, that happened with the second and third one, and then also with the Final Frontier and Undiscovered Country and stuff. So, I think, it was quite an interesting, more mainstream appeal, maybe. And I know that film had really good word of mouth among the audience. And then we get to where things start going really wrong.
To say the least.
I think they offered Final Frontier to Nimoy, but he didn't want to do it because the screenplay was so bad. And they basically couldn't get anyone to do it because the screenplay was just terrible. So they got Shatner because he'd say yes to doing pretty much anything. I wrote in my notes for this that this is where the industry's view of the series was irreparably tanked. So basically the screenplay
good old Shatner.
The screenplay was shockingly bad. Shatner's direction was terrible on it, and he had the characters doing all kinds of things that the actors objected to. Roddenberry gave the thumbs down to the script. Especially in the original earlier drafts of the film, the whole the division between the captain and the rest of the crew, and that they sort of abandoned him and didn't trust him and all that stuff. So that was, and Roddenberry was vocally pretty vocal in his hatred for the film. He said he called it apocryphal, so he doesn't even consider it to be canon Star Trek. So that's pretty bad. That's about as bad as
when the creator of the thing says this one doesn't count.
But the plus side is that the studio did learn its lesson with that one. They got Meyer back in. They got someone back in who knew what they were doing, who was part of the most well received within the fandom movie. Try and get, because they thought maybe we're not going to be able to get the mainstream appeal back from what we got from the Voyage home, but at least we can try and get the actual core fan base back. So they got Meyer back. Having said that, though, getting a proper director back in charge was not enough for the view within the industry to improve. And I don't know if necessarily anything they could do would have helped much with that. At that point, I think it was pretty much done.
I think they're lucky they got they got one more movie after 5, honestly. I mean, because it was such a farce. I mean, and they were able to, I think, and I don't know how it was perceived in the industry. I can't imagine that, studio executives gave much of a shit, but the idea of, well, let's do one more and let's make it the last one and let's give them a proper send off, that's really, because the movie was really marketed heavily as this is the last one, and this is the swan song for the original cast, because Next Generation was on TV by that point and was really hitting its stride, and they didn't have to rely on Captain Kirk to carry the franchise anymore. So,
right. Because it was like 1991 or something, right? So
91.
It's already been on for like a couple of years. I think And from what I've heard among the Trekkies, is that the ending of the film was viewed quite positively. That the send off was viewed well.
Oh yeah, so
And
much so
then,
that it was a disappointment when they brought some of the characters back for the next
yeah,
movie, because it's like, oh
indeed.
no, the ending was so perfect. Why are you bringing them back?
Yeah. It was
Yeah.
that was obviously done purely for money, so they
Oh
for
yeah.
audience draw purposes. Yeah, look,
Yeah.
we got the ones back from the from the movies, not just from the show. But yeah, so yeah, let's talk about Generations.
Oh boy. Yeah.
So the guy who directed that, David Carson, he's a TV director, right?
Mm.
And casting a TV director to direct a movie, that is not viewed in that era of the film industry. That is like to say that's looked down upon is a real heavy understatement. It was extremely negatively viewed, and it's one thing to sort of install a TV director who'd never made a movie before. If they were wanting to move into films and leave TV behind, but Carson went right back to doing TV. He was
Yeah.
he knew he was a TV guy, and he made no bones about it.
Yeah.
So it's
And,
like,
and I think with Carson, because I remember I was only 14 when the movie came out, but the internet was still a thing. It just wasn't nearly as big as it is now. And there were Star Trek fans at the time who weren't necessarily film industry people, who were sort of grumbling about the fact that they just picked one of their TV directors to direct the first movie, because it just felt like, oh, okay, so you're just, I mean, Carson is a solid, he's a good hand, but he's not distinguished in any way as an artist. I mean, he's
right.
a guy who will get it done. And
Because that is the thing about
yeah.
TV directors, is that in TV the writers are the ones who are really in charge, not the directors, like it is in the film industry. So it even really, if they needed any more evidence of that the Paramount was wanting to control these people, you can look no further than hiring a TV director. That is a really strong sign that they wanted someone that they could boss around, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think with Generations, there's also the perception, again, from the outside, not knowing how it was perceived by people in the industry, but it felt like Paramount was getting to a point with Star Trek at that point in the franchise where they wanted to have a movie, and we want to have a Star Trek movie, and these are the guys we're going to do it with now, because their show is the show that's ending, and they're the hot property now, and we retired the old guys, and we're just going to put out a movie, because there's so much about Generations that feels really half-hearted and just kind of half finished. Like, they wanted it to be a crossover movie between the two crews, but it wasn't. They got Shatner.
They could only get 3 of them, right?
They got 3, and they were barely in it. So it was about 75% of a Next Generation movie, and then 25% of just sort of half-hearted appearances by members of the old cast. And it really feels like, if you wanted to do a crossover movie, then do a proper one. And if you didn't want to do that, then just skip ahead. Just do a Next Generation movie. It's not like we're not going to buy it. We've been watching the show for 7 years. We'll at least sit through one Captain Picard movie. But yeah.
But yeah, if you compare the motion picture and their choice of Robert Weiss with the first Next Generation movie and their choice of David Carson, I mean, it's like a laughing stock at that point.
Yeah, it's a bit of a step down.
Yeah. But it's interesting because they did the same thing again, kind of, with the Star Trek reboot, because Abrams came from TV originally as well.
That's true.
But
he had
by
a few
that point,
movies under his belt. Yeah,
well, he made one. I'm going to get to that. But
okay,
the image of TV had radically changed by that point. Sort of around 2005, 2006 was when the image of the TV industry started to be radically changed within the film industry. And so this is 2009. So that by that point. And Lost was one of the shows that really helped contribute to that, even though I'm not a fan of Lost myself, but I get why people like it, and the sort of long form storytelling stuff in that show was appealing to a lot of filmmakers. So it's really interesting that they did the same thing again, but by that point it was a good decision, not a bad decision. And it did help that Abrams was the creator of the show, not just one of their random directors. So it wasn't exactly the same, but
right.
But yeah, and he was seen as a good choice because he demonstrated skill working within someone else's franchise, because he did Mission Impossible 3. And that was easily the best Mission Impossible movie that had been made up to that point. In my opinion, probably is still the best one. I know a lot of people like the fourth one as well, but I think Mission Impossible 3 is just miles better than the other two, the previous two, especially the second one, which was just But so he was a guy who'd come along and rescued this kind of dwindling franchise that was kind of a bit of a joke, and he made it into something solid, and it's still working now. People, they're still making these things. So, he really actually saved that franchise. So, but within the industry, he was viewed as kind of like a really legit guy. He'd come along. He didn't have any qualms about working in somebody else's thing that he didn't really have much say over, but he did a really good job on it. He saved that franchise, and he'd made the first season of Fringe as well. That had already come out, I think, by the time he was working on Star Trek reboot. So, and like Lost wasn't pure sci-fi. It was more of a drama, but it had sci-fi elements, whereas Fringe was like solid sci-fi. So he had sci-fi credentials. He had movie industry credentials. He had other people's franchise credentials. So he was a really great choice, I think. And 15 years though is the separation between Generations and reboot, and that's a real different that change in that 15-year period was like massive. The perception of the TV industry though. Having said that though, Abrams' image within the film industry isn't as good now as it was then. And part of that is because he keeps working with these writers that they're called the Save the Cat crew, the Save the Cat writers. I don't know if you know what Save the Cat is. It's a book by a guy called Blake Snyder, who it's one of those screenwriting books that, you read this one book and suddenly you can screenwrite kind of thing.
Oh,
like,
sure, yeah.
Damon Lindelof is like really known for his association with that book, and he's praised it in interviews and stuff. And it's got a really bad image within the film industry. It's kind of like really not producing great screenwriting. And Robert Orci as well. Those guys, they're all in that sort of that group. And it wasn't really until Prometheus and Star Trek Into Darkness that people in the film industry realized that this stuff isn't actually great. This is actually kind of shit, basically. Yeah. So so those are the films that I wanted to sort of go through. I think the other one, I mean, I guess I get one thing I'd say about First Contact is that the screenplay for that film was actually pretty bad. It was really saved by its direction. And that was interesting because there was Jonathan Frakes that directed that, right?
Yeah,
so
it was another cast member.
Yeah. So that was interesting because he really saved that movie. If that screenplay was not good, and it still has massive issues, like the one that Red Letter Media brings up, which is that it's a time travel movie. They didn't need to time travel in orbit. They could have just time traveled from the other side of the fucking galaxy and then gone back when there was no massive fleet around Earth and not lost anybody, So the whole sort of story doesn't really make any sense. And then, I have to, it's slightly difficult for me to admit that because the guy who wrote that was Ron Moore, who's like my hero. I like worship that guy. His show Battlestar Galactica is my favorite thing ever. It's like, not just my favorite show, it's my favorite anything,
Yeah, and he also he had a very large hand in Deep Space Nine as well.
Yeah, he basically for the last 3 seasons he was the sort of de facto showrunner. He wasn't credited in that role, but he was basically showrunning it for the last 3 years. Yeah. And those are the best 3 years of the show, so he also had I think he had a hand in Voyager as well, which wasn't as good, but
he was on Voyager for less than a season after Deep Space Nine ended, and he left because it's actually, if you look it up, you have to do a little bit of Googling. I forget exactly where it is, but there's an interview with him from like the contemporary from around like 99, 2000, right after he had just left Voyager after his short stint, and he sort of vents some of his frustrations with the show about how he would because he was coming from Deep Space Nine where there was a lot of serialized storytelling, and the show really benefited from establishing characters and showing how they evolve through the various seasons, so that the characters at the end of the series are very different than they were at the beginning of the series. And Voyager was conducted with almost the exact opposite philosophy, where they wanted to keep things the same from episode to episode, and they didn't do a whole lot of character development or a lot of multi-episode story arcs, and so much to the point. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say that I think I'm right in saying this. There's an arc in is it the second to last season of Deep Space Nine that's like 7 episodes long.
Oh
Where they're
yeah,
like it's the same basic like framework of loose. They're not like listed 1 to 7 parts, 1 to 7, but like
right.
it's the same loosely the same story throughout the whole 7 episodes, and
Yeah,
that was like unheard of at the time. I think
yeah,
Deep Space Nine and X Files in the 90s were really the driving force behind working towards. They were sort of the semi-serialized sort of format where it was like a stepping stone between what came later with HBO and then what was previous to that, where like with the Simpsons, where everything would go exactly back to normal at the end of every episode, and they would even make jokes about it. You're like, do you think you'd learned anything or grew as a person? Nope. Sort of thing.
Yeah. So I mean, because and that was one of the things that I think Ron Moore was butting heads with the producers of Voyager about was, he would ask, because he wasn't as familiar with the show as he was obviously with the show he had just got done working on, and he would ask questions about characters on Voyager, and he would say like, well, what about B'Elanna, the chief engineer of the ship? What about her? Would she do this or would she do that? And the producers would basically say, look, don't worry about it. Just write whatever you want. And he was like, but I mean, this is like season 5 or 6 of the show at this point. Like these characters should be pretty well established. And you're telling me to just go ahead and do whatever I want with one of the main characters.
Yeah, there's that thing where you kind of just like, you write the line of dialogue, then you choose who said it later, like.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody has to say this. This is a good line. I don't care who says it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was sort of like, and his justification was when they came back at him with, well, we want to keep things fairly static because, we want people might not watch every episode. And his response was, well, but don't we want people to watch every episode? Like, why can't we give them a hook that'll have them coming back for the next show? Like, why do we have to keep it so every episode is in such a bubble that what happens in one episode has no effect on what happens in the next episode? That doesn't make sense. But yeah.
So yeah, I can see why he left. Yeah, for sure.
Well, you can see like when you look at what he did with Battlestar Galactica, especially. I mean, you can see sort of the beginning of some of that sort of stuff in his Deep Space Nine stuff, where he's moving in a more mature direction, more sort of a darker direction, setting up a world and then kind of interrogating it. Figuring out like, well, why people act this way, but why do they act this way? And they have these ethics, but do they really have these ethics? What happens when they're tested? What happens when they have to make difficult decisions? And that certainly was not. Yeah.
So I was going to say, and making the events that happen to the characters so monumental and impactful that they changed as people after it, and their writing became different after that event. Which has never really happened in TV before that. Well, I mean, he wasn't the one who was pioneered it, but he was part of the sort of group of TV shows that were responsible for introducing that into TV.
Yeah,
it wasn't the first, but he was one of the major ones. Yeah. Whereas, I think before that, there was a sort of hard limit on what you could do to a character in a TV show because you wouldn't want them to change too much,
Well, and especially in something like Star Trek, which, I mean, as much as I love Star Trek: The Next Generation, it is a very static show. I mean, the characters don't really change all that much from first season to last season. I mean, even Captain Picard, who at one point gets transformed into a Borg, really he comes out the other side pretty much the same guy that he was. It doesn't really affect him at all until all of a sudden it bothers him really, really bad in First Contact. It's like, wow, I thought you were over this though. Now all of a sudden it's like, but introducing that into Star Trek, where no, we're going to have complicated stories and they're going to last multiple episodes, and the characters aren't always going to do the right thing, and they're going to doubt themselves, and they're going to have to face consequences for their actions, and they're going to change and grow, and I think a lot of people on the outside don't realize how insulated Star Trek is, especially to the fans, where Star Trek is sort of viewed as its own thing. And even if a Star Trek, like what's happening with Discovery now, where Discovery isn't really doing anything that hasn't been done on 5 or 6 other shows before, in terms of the way it tells its story and the way it handles its characters. But it's never been done like that in Star Trek before. So to a Star Trek fan, it feels either like revolutionary in a good way or almost blasphemous, where like, why are they doing this?
Yeah. I was just going to say that the only character that really had a major arc in TNG was Wesley, and the reason that they gave him that arc is because they wanted to get rid of him because the fans didn't like him. It's like, we need to get this. We need to get this guy off the ship, so we got to give him a motivation to make that decision. So we got to have him go through some shit. Yeah. So that's great. It's funny. Yeah. But yeah, so I just wanted to. So I just wanted to quickly mention the sort of times on my channel that I've brought up Star Trek before. I did a video called Martian Gravity where I was talking about scientific accuracy / inaccuracy in movies, and talking about how the scientific community has a real double standard regarding that, depending on whether they liked it in a general sense or not. Suddenly they're really sort of willing to forgive scientific inaccuracy. And the example I give in the video is Neil deGrasse Tyson. About how he'd done a lot of tweets, and he even put out some videos on YouTube through Business Insider and other things, just trashing gravity's scientific inaccuracy. And then I found just when I was doing the notes for this hangout, I came across this Nerdist video he did where he was talking about the science of Star Trek, and he wasn't trashing it at all. He was celebrating it. It's like, well, hold on. Star Trek's way more inaccurate than anything in Gravity. Like, well, I mean, Gravity is very scientifically inaccurate, but Star Trek has people traveling like 10 times faster than the speed of light, and all kinds of stuff. And like the transporters, that alone is like, how does that even work? And like, there's no feasible way that could possibly work. Without
it was invented for narrative convenience. Like there wasn't even a scientific reason why they did that. It was just we'll save a lot of money by having them be able to just vanish from the ship. You know what I mean?
Yeah. We won't have to use the transporter sets so much and all those plate shots of the transporters flying through space and all that. Yeah,
right. Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting because in that video they were doing that thing where there's a documentary, I can't remember what it's called now, which is about how Star Trek influenced science and influenced inventors. I can't remember what that's called. I should probably have looked that up, but it's quite a good documentary, and they talk about how the communicators in the original series influenced the creation of cell phones, and they got the guy who invented the team of people at I can't remember what company it was that invented the first cell phone, talking about how they literally took direct inspiration from Star Trek. That was kind of what that video was about, but they were hand waving a lot of stuff in it, and it was really interesting sort of double standard about that. And it's because Neil deGrasse Tyson is a fan of Star Trek. That's why he's willing to forgive it, So yeah, there's that. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is so I did a video about Discovery and about how there's a lot of people online who are sort of judging it really early on. I think it's a bit more understandable now that we're most of the way through the first season, but this is like in the first few episodes where people were putting out reviews after because the Cracked one, they'd done 2 episodes and there was 2 episodes of a 3-episode arc,
Right.
So they weren't even let's not even wait for the arc to finish, with a natural, let's review the beginning and middle of one story arc, so it's kind of approach. And I was just sort of trashing them for calling themselves Star Trek fans without seeming to realize that Star Trek shows tend to get a lot better as they go on. That's generally been the model. I mean, with TNG and DS9 specifically, and actually with what was the later one? I always forget the name of it. Enterprise. Yeah, that one definitely got better as it went on as well. The 3rd series of that was the 4th series was the last one they did. The 4th series of that was really actually quite good.
The last year was maybe the best year, and that's when they canceled it.
Yeah, of course. And the other thing I wanted to mention about Discovery is that one thing I think that works in its favor, because I see it in my video about it, that I don't think anything that they're doing at the moment is like the height of Star Trek or anything, but the things they're doing, even though they may not be executing them as well as they could, it shows that the show is in quite capable hands because of the sort of stories they're doing. And I mentioned in the 4th episode where they have the monster creature that they think is the predator, and they're scared of it, and then they realize that it's actually just frightened and defending itself, and it's just misunderstood. And it struck me as an incredibly Star Trek thing to do, right? having this communication problem being the real thing, between a barrier between two different aliens races, like that.
Yeah, very
but
much
actually
so.
if you just talk to each other and communicate, you can actually work out you're not that different, kind of. That's like what Star Trek is. That's what Star Trek's always been about. So that's, even though the episode may not have been that well handled, the idea behind it was a promising sign. And I still think that's the case with what they're doing now. But one thing I wanted to bring up is that the fan theories about the show, because I was watching a lot of YouTube videos through the first half of the first season, just what fans were having to say about it when I was researching that video. And that there was a lot of people making fan theories that were all quite compelling and interesting, and they were all right. All of the ones I saw were accurate. And I think that, to me, is a real credit to that show. That's a really good sign when the fan theories that are the most interesting and unique, and the ones that have the most potential, turned out to be correct.
Yeah, I agree. If I had I've really liked the show so far. I like you just said a minute ago, I don't think it's the best Star Trek has ever done. I don't think it's even really in the conversation when you compare it to like the best of Deep Space Nine, for instance. But it's very solid. It's very good. And, I was very happy to hear that it was renewed for a second season and they're going to do another one. Like, I think that's all. I'm very happy about that. And the set design is great. The direction, the technical aspects are terrific. The acting, for the most part, has been terrific, especially for a Star Trek show. Star Trek isn't always noted for its great acting, but I
was really, really happy when they cast Jason Isaacs, because he's a great actor. He's really good. Have you seen Brotherhood, his show that he did?
No, I haven't.
It's a Showtime show about these two brothers, and they're Irish Americans, and it's based on the Whitey Bulger true crime story. The Boston guy his brother was a state senator.
Yeah,
his best friend was in the FBI, kind of thing. But it's a retelling of that story, a reimagining of that story. So one of them's an organized crime figure, and the other brother is a member of the state legislature. Wow. So it's really well acted, and he is great in it. And he's a villainous character. He's really good in it. And so I was like, oh, they're actually casting like really top tier actors in this. That's really cool.
Yeah, he's fantastic, and he's been really good in the show, playing a really interesting character that's taken some twists and turns. And and I like it a lot. I think one of the things that keeps me from connecting with it too closely is that even though I don't necessarily dislike any of the twists, but I feel like the writing of the show has been more invested in the twists and the sort of clever plot turns than it has been in establishing characters and establishing like a sense of location and a sense of a world, because it's, even though it takes place in the Star Trek universe, it's a view of it that we've never really seen before, and it looks a lot different. There aren't a whole lot of references visually to older versions of Star Trek. The closest reference is probably to the newer movies in terms of the design and the style.
They've basically tried to sort of backdate that a little bit from the movie to make it, because it's set 10 years before the first Star Trek,
before the original series.
So it's like they're like done a little bit retro, slightly pushed back version of that. But I agree that it's, and they've kind of, I think one of the problems with the show is that they've kind of rubbed it in the fans' faces how visually different it is. Like they had that sequence in the pilot where she goes out into space and she's rocketing through space in a spacesuit and stuff. It's like, I get that they couldn't do this stuff in the earlier Star Trek shows, and that's why they didn't. But the fact that they didn't established like a visual language of the shows, and now they're doing this stuff that they'd never done before, and it just seems like she wouldn't have done that, and
the fact that they're doing it all of a sudden, and they're doing it in a show that is supposedly taking place around roughly the same time period as a previously established show. I know those kinds of things, I know they bother some people a lot. They don't really bother me. They bother me enough that I notice it, but it doesn't really ruin the show. It's just like the redesign of the Klingons. I know a lot of people have a huge problem with the redesign of the Klingons, and I noticed it in the first 2 episodes. I was very aware of it, but after that, I just kind of got used to it. I just this is how the Klingons look.
That's exactly what I said in the video.
Yeah.
I said the first 2 episodes, I didn't like it, and I didn't like how they were performing the lines in the Klingon language. They felt like
It was very different.
They didn't really know what they were like. The actors didn't really. They didn't say the lines as if they even understood what they were saying, kind of thing. Like, you know, they were just like, I'm saying random alien words right now, kind of thing, in a really stilted and generic way. So they're like, but they're all stuff that has gotten better, and I have adjusted to it as it's gone on.
Yeah. And, you know, and one of the things that Star Trek fans have to understand is, you know, every time there's a gap in the franchise and then they come back with a new thing, every time that has happened, there has been a subset of the fan base that has rebelled. And after a few years go by, that sort of subsides and it becomes accepted. Because I remember I was only a kid when Next Generation started on TV, but I watched it from the very beginning. And I remember, because like my mother was a Star Trek fan and she was not having it at first. Like when she like, oh, who's this bald guy? Who's the captain? Who's he? Well, why is there a Klingon on the crew? Like, she was not having it at all. But by the 3rd season, it was like appointment television. She loved it.
Yeah.
And when Deep Space Nine started, I remember there were fans who didn't like it because it was too different, because it was too dark, because it wasn't on a ship, it was on a space station, and that's not what Star Trek is about, and it's boring and blah, blah, blah. And eventually, and there are still some people who don't like Deep Space Nine, but eventually it was fairly well accepted, and now it's one of the more celebrated parts of the franchise. And that happens every time.
I think the biggest change with Deep Space Nine is that before Deep Space Nine, technology was a great thing in Star Trek. Technology was your friend. Technology was a help. But because they were living on a space station built by a hostile alien race, technology was kind of against them in that show quite a lot. So that was quite a big change. And I think it was not a very Roddenberry thing to do. But, you know, at the same time, Roddenberry's not like a god who always makes great decisions. So, you know,
no, it's not like... In fact, I'm one of those Star Trek fans that believes it is not a coincidence that as Roddenberry's influence waned, the Star Trek product got better. Like, right. You know, if you look at in the original series, episodes that he had less of a role in writing turn out to be some of the best episodes that were written by DC Fontana or Gene Kuhn wound up being really stellar, or David Gerald wound up being some of the more celebrated episodes. And in Next Generation, when he stepped away after season 2 and took less of an active role, the quality of the show got better. Star Trek 2, where Harve Bennett took over as producer and Roddenberry was no longer in control, this franchise got a lot better. So I'm not necessarily a huge Roddenberry fan. It's weird. I view him in the same way as I view Bob Kane, the guy who created Batman, where he came up with a really great idea and he had a certain amount of talent, but other more talented people took his idea and really managed to flesh it out and make it into the thing that wound up becoming beloved, you know. And I think with Star Trek, I think that's definitely the case.
It reminds me of an episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where they try and make a movie, and they hire this Indian guy because they figure Indian guys are great at making movies because of M. Night Shyamalan. And then there's a great line where he's like, "Hey, hold on, you know, what are you expecting me to do? The granular work? I'm an ideas man, you know." Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. He strikes me as an ideas guy.
Yeah, I think that's what he was. Yeah.
So should we talk about Superman for a while?
Yeah, actually, you know, I want to try to build a slight bridge between Star Trek and Superman.
Sounds great to me.
Other than the fact that I like them both and I talk about them both a lot. But you talked a little bit about JJ Abrams and how, you know, he sort of has traveled the road from being a TV guy to a movie guy. Now he's kind of both. And one of the first exposures I had to JJ Abrams, because his first big TV project was Felicity. I never really watched Felicity. I wasn't a big fan of it. I never watched Lost. I never watched much of Fringe. I saw Mission Impossible 3 and thought that was good. That was really my first exposure to him in a real way. But he wrote a screenplay for a proposed Superman movie that never got off the ground.
He started out as a screenwriter. He started really young as he wrote his first produced screenplay when he was like 19 or 20 or something.
Yeah.
Regarding Henry, which wasn't a great movie and it certainly wasn't a great screenplay, but he got it produced. So,
yeah, that was his foot in the door, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And how weird is it to think that the guy who wrote Regarding Henry is now like
the guy running Star Wars and Star Trek.
Yeah, it's crazy. So he wrote this screenplay for a Superman movie that I think at the time was going to be directed by McG, the director of Charlie's Angels, and various television commercials. And it never got anywhere. It never got made, but the screenplay got leaked and it was online and I read it and I hated it. I thought it was the worst thing I'd ever read. And I was like, thank God they're not making this movie. It was, it was very action oriented. They were definitely they wanted to do a more action oriented Superman movie, which is fine. But the way it read on the page, it just felt really silly. Like he wrote a scene where the conceit was that it wasn't Superman himself who had the powers. It was the suit, which sounds like the greatest American hero. It doesn't sound like Superman. And there was a scene where like the suit comes out of a box and it's standing there on its own, like with nobody in it. And I just thought, God, that sounds awful. This just sounds so awful. And like Lex Luthor was a CIA agent. He wasn't, he wasn't anywhere. He was not, he bore almost no resemblance to any previous version of the character from the comics or the old movies or TV or whatever. It was just a completely different character that they called Lex Luthor. And I hated it. And that gave me like a bad impression of JJ Abrams, where I was like, God, what the fuck is this guy? And then I really liked his Star Trek movie, and I saw some of his other stuff that he directed, and I thought, yeah, actually, he's not so bad.
With the Superman thing, that wasn't his fault. I don't know how much you know about who was handling the Superman.
I'm sure he had a lot of notes that he had to incorporate.
Well, there's a specific guy. I can't actually remember what his name is. I could look it up because he was the guy behind Superman Lives. But there was a Hollywood producer who.
Oh, I know.
Kevin Smith tells this famous story about how he was hired to rewrite Superman Lives, and the guy wanted to put a giant spider in it, and then he went on to make Wild Wild West, which has a giant spider in it for no reason. For no reason at all. No reason. And so, I would say that was probably producer interference with the script. And like Kevin,
I would be surprised.
The difference between a Kevin Smith and a JJ Abrams is that Kevin Smith quit that project in disgust because he didn't want to be pushed around. JJ Abrams is pretty happy to be pushed around. I think that's the difference between the two of them. JJ Abrams is the kind of guy who's happy to work for other people, work in a certain role in a franchise kind of thing. And that is what made him good at handling Mission Impossible and Star Trek. And to a lesser degree, Star Wars.
Yeah.
Because The Force Awakens was basically just A New Hope again. Which, it wasn't too bad of a decision, but it was, it could have been better. But anyway, so
So the perception of Superman
story.
Yeah.
So I thought one of the reasons I thought it would be good to bring up Superman, other than the fact that you talk about it, is that the Superman film series kind of represents the opposite of the Star Trek series in a way. I mean, they're both viewed negatively within the industry, but for the opposite reason, basically. So, the first Superman movie is a classic film. It was great. And it was the first big budget studio superhero film. I think there was a studio that did Superman and the Mole Men, but that's actually not technically a feature film because it was only 58 minutes long. And the cutoff is an hour, so you have to be longer than an hour. And I think they intentionally didn't make it a feature because it was supposed to test the viability of a potential TV series. That's why they made it.
Exactly.
And so they intentionally didn't make it a feature. But so Superman, the first Superman by Richard Donner, is considered the first proper superhero film, certainly the first proper Superman movie. And there was signs of the sort of studio fuckery that would to come later. There were signs on that film already. They chose a great director with Richard Donner. It's different though it's the exact opposite thing than Robert Weiss though, because Richard Donner was a young director. I think he'd done, what was it, like 1 or 2 movies before that, but he'd done The Omen.
The Omen.
So he was like, he was a big deal in the industry, even though he was young, because The Omen was like a huge thing within the film industry that was really daring. And around that time was like Rosemary's Baby was coming out, I guess, around the same time. So like really bold and different horror films were kind of a big thing in the industry at the time. And he was part of the reason for that. So he was, he had a good reputation. but the screenwriters on that film. So that the studio was testing out who they wanted to write the movie based on how famous they were.
Yeah.
Literally, there was a discussion they had. They wanted to hire Mario Puzo to write the fucking screenplay because he was really famous because of The Godfather.
Not the first name that comes to mind when you think of writing a Superman movie.
No, not at all. I mean, God, the mafia movies are about like the dark side of human nature and all that, whereas Superman is supposed to be the opposite, right? And another interesting thing about that first Superman movie, I don't have a huge amount to say about it, but one of the interesting things is that Richard Lester actually worked on that movie as in an uncredited role as a line producer. And that's it's an interesting job, because what the line producer does is they're basically the producer that budgets the movie. And in that role, they work really closely with the director by necessity. And so they're kind of like the bridge between the producing staff, the producers, like the executive producers, and co-producers. Associate producer isn't a real job. That's just the thing they give to people who like gave them money or whatever. That's not a real role. But the other three, they're kind of like the line producers, like the bridge between the director and them. And it's quite common practice, not universal, but quite common practice in the industry for the director to work with the same line producer, and they sort of follow them from project to project as their sort of representative in the producing staff. So they hired this guy to be their intermediary with Richard Donner. And that's how they first came into contact with each other, which I just thought was quite interesting given what was going to happen later.
Yeah.
So Superman 2 had a really, really long production cycle. It was like a year over, like by the time they went on hiatus and fired Richard Donner. It was like a year over time. But after they went on hiatus, the first Superman movie was released, and it made a bunch of money. It was really successful. So but that didn't affect their faith they had in Donner at all. Like they were just like, fuck him, he's gone. They didn't care. And so that really shows a lack of respect and just bad industry practice. Like there's a really famous comparison to that I want to make about Titanic. So Titanic was over budget. So like, I don't know how much the budget was, but say it wasn't, but say it was $100 million. It was more than $200 million that it cost halfway through this production cycle. Or maybe even slightly less than halfway through. And the producers were panicking. They were like, oh my God, this is a disaster. And basically what happened is James Cameron went around them and went straight to Rupert Murdoch and sat down in a meeting with Rupert Murdoch and said, look, this movie is going to be a fucking huge hit. It's going to be my masterpiece. And, from his point of view, it is his masterpiece because he's got this weird obsession with water, but that's a whole other thing. So he basically sat down with Rupert Murdoch and he said, look, this is my baby. I'm going to make it. You're going to make a bunch of money. Just have faith in me. And Rupert Murdoch said, you can spend whatever you want. And so that is like the opposite, basically, of what they did to Richard Donner. And if they just let Richard Donner run with it, Superman 2 would have made a bunch of money and would have been profitable, but they weren't brave, the producers of that film. They were really, really weak-willed and really like paranoid and scared and stuff. So they're just not very good at the film industry, I guess, at working at that level,
Well, I think also, because it was the Salkinds who were
that's right,
kind of iconoclastic. They were kind of, they were, I mean, it doesn't really make sense to call them independent producers because their budgets were so huge, but they were kind of their own little company, and they were used to just doing what they wanted. They had done the Three Musketeers, I think was their last big project before Superman, and that had been.
They did the Fourth Musketeers as well. They did a sequel to it. Yeah,
which I think they filmed the same way that they did Superman and Superman 2, where they did two movies back to back, and they did the sequel. They produce a lot of the sequel at the same time as they produced the first one. And it reminds me of what you were saying earlier about how Paramount was perhaps choosing Star Trek directors that they thought they could control and keep a firm hand on. And I think one of the problems between the Salkinds and Donner was that there were a lot of conflicts between the two, where Donner wanted to go one way and they wanted to go another. So of course, when they replace him with Lester for Superman 2, they replaced not only the guy who had been their guy as the line producer on the first, but Lester, of course, had also directed their Musketeers movies for them. So he was very much their guy, and they knew that they could trust him to do what they wanted to do, as opposed to constantly having to butt heads.
Exactly. So that's why I kind of said it was the opposite of Star Trek, because they thought they were doing the classic install a young guy so you can push him around thing with Donner. But Richard Donner is not like that. He's never been like that, and he's always been quite a headstrong director. And I think on Lethal Weapon he was making a lot of decisions that the studio was like, what the hell, kind of thing. But and it turned out to be successful though. So studios kind of just let him. He's kind of like Peter Jackson in a way. Studios just kind of let him do whatever he does. They know the movie will make money, so it doesn't really matter. So So it's kind of interesting though, because Richard Lester was the opposite. He'd done a ton of movies, not a ton of great movies, but he'd done a ton of, like, if you just look at his filmography, just purely on the list of the movies, he doesn't seem like an immediate choice for someone you want to be able to push around because he was so established.
Yeah.
But he was a really push aroundable guy because he just didn't really give a shit. He didn't really care about the kind of stuff he was doing. He's a really like pay kind of director. He's a guy you hire. He'll be on set and he'll tell people what to do. But other than that, it's like, I don't really care. He's not a passionate guy, basically.
Right. And I think you can tell, when you look at his filmography, you can kind of tell there aren't very many things that jump out there as passion projects. That's Richard Lester's baby. It's
exactly. He done the Beatles movies.
Yeah, he did A Hard Day's Night, which is probably the one that sticks out the most. Is like,
and he done Help as well. Yeah, and to me though, I think probably the Beatles backseat directed quite a lot of those movies. So it's interesting, but so. It's Superman 3 though is where you could really tell that Richard Lester does not give a fuck about Superman. He just did not care. He wanted to make a freaking comedy movie, that's what he set out to do. He's like, I'm going to make a comedy, and it's like, really, on a Superman movie, you're going to make a comedy? Like, I mean, fair enough if you want to have some gags. Most big studio movies have a decent amount of comedy throughout to just keep people engaged and stuff, and keep things not too heavy, but. To make a literal comedy movie with fucking Richard Pryor and stuff, like that's just like, no, dude, not a great idea. No. But the fact that it wasn't suitable for the franchise didn't enter into his thought process at all.
Well, and that was another one too, where it just, I think part of the problem with Superman 3, other than just how weird the concept is of let's do a Richard Pryor comedy in a Superman movie, is they didn't give Richard Pryor funny things to do. They just sort of they assumed that Richard Pryor would just come in and make it funny.
Right.
And Richard Pryor was a genius, but he wasn't the sort of genius that you could just point a camera at him with and say, "Okay, Richard, make us laugh." You know what I mean? Like if he was the writer, if he was creating it himself, then he was one of the funniest people who ever lived. But if you just give him a script and then say, "Okay, now do this, but do it funny," you're not really. You shouldn't expect fantastic results. And they did. That's not what they got. They got a pretty terrible movie.
And Lester was able to get that past the studio because Richard Pryor was so huge at the time. He was like on top of the world. And so they just figured, the studio would have just figured, oh yeah, he's famous, so it'll work. But no, it didn't. And then Superman 4, well, holy shit. So this is
where they just gave it to Canon and said, fuck it.
Yeah, exactly. So the Sidney Fury. I don't know how to say his name. Yeah, the guy. Fury. So the whole team behind that, just reeks of. So it was purely made to make a quick buck. It was cashing in on the audience draw of the intellectual property and the character, while putting very little actual money into it to maximize the profit potential. Right. Yeah. So. And that in the film industry is what's called a Z grade mentality, right? And there's a great. Are you familiar with the show Dinner for Five? It was a show from about 10 years ago.
I've heard of it, but I never watched it.
So Jon Favreau basically hosts the show where he gets his film industry pals around the table and they chat about stories from the film industry. It's not just film industry people. There's TV people and there's stand-up comedy people, but it's mostly entertainment industry folks generally. Yeah. And he has a few musicians as well. But so Roger Corman was on one episode. It's episode 3 of season 4. And I tried to download it so I could remember the name of the specific series that he mentions in it, but I couldn't download it in time for this hangout because it's really slow. But so basically in that episode of Dinner for Five, Roger Corman recounts the story where he had this franchise, and I can't remember what it's called, but But he basically describes the process that he did at his company, where they would basically make a first movie, and then they would see how much money that movie made, and then they would draw a graph out where they would say, okay, so each movie is going to make less money than the one before, because that's how it works in Z grade. And then, which is actually the opposite of like mainstream Hollywood, where the sequel generally makes more money than the previous one. Like if you look at Die Hard is a great example of this. In the VHS era, this has been the case anyway, where Die Hard actually made a lot less money than Die Hard 2. Because a lot of the people that love Die Hard saw it on video and didn't actually contribute to the cinema, like the box office gross. So Die Hard 2 made a ton more money at the box office than the first one, but in Z grade it works the other way around. Each film gets less viewership than the one before. So they literally made a graph where they were like, okay, by the fifth one, it's actually making less than we're putting into it. So we got to stop making it by the fifth one. And they would, and that is the approach that Superman 4 took. They thought, all right, how much money can we spend on this that we can guarantee will make money regardless of how bullshit the movie is. And that's literally how they did it. They approached it like Roger Corman, except, without the skill that Roger Corman had.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's fascinating and kind of dismaying as a fan of the franchise to look at how it went from, and just in the space of really, I mean, Superman 4 was 1987, so that's less than 10 years after the first movie. And and Superman the movie was a huge hit and was pretty well regarded critically. Superman 2 pretty big hit, fairly well regarded critically, not as much as the first one, but still a success. Superman 3, not good at all, but it was at least a studio movie. It had a budget, and then it's like it's like after Superman 3, they go into this phase where the Salkinds are just trying to bleed the license dry before they sell it back to Warner Brothers, where they do the Supergirl movie, which isn't very good and didn't do very much. And then they do Superman 4, which is like, God, why even bother? And then they did the Superboy TV series, the syndicated TV series in the early 90s. And then that was basically it. That was the last involvement they had with the character. But it's like, how can you go from, the pinnacle of the character in terms of pop culture to Superman 4, directed by nobody, starring Christopher Reeve, Gene Hackman, and nobody else of consequence. And, and that's 9 years later. I mean, how can you drive it into the ditch that quickly after having such a massive success?
Yeah, and if they just had a little bit more faith in Richard Donner, none of that would have happened. Yeah,
it does. It's interesting if that movie had been made in today's environment, where studios are more apt to trust a director after a big success. It may have been a much different story. Because look at how the Marvel Studios films go, where Iron Man. I think it's pretty safe to say the first Iron Man movie outperformed expectations, and
it definitely did.
And so they gave Jon Favreau,
another
free
Iron
rein
Man
to do
movie. But he didn't have control of the script or the cut, though. None of the Marvel directors ever have. I'm actually working on a script about Marvel at the moment, about the MCU, and it's a big part of it is about how they never give the directors control, and this is part of their strategy for making it a whole one big world and stuff. And that has upsides and downsides and all that. But so I think the at least the first, because I don't actually know very much about the other Superman film, what's his name? I can't remember his goddamn name. The Usual Suspects director.
Bryan Singer,
Bryan Singer, So I don't actually know anything about the sort of details about that. I was actually not even working in so I took a few years off from the film industry, and that was 2006, right? That came out.
Yes,
that was the year I stopped. Until like 2009, I was out of the industry for a few years. It was at university, and I was traveling and stuff. So I saw that movie in Korea. So I was way out of the loop by that point. So I don't know anything about the making of that film, behind the scenes details or anything like that. But I mean, I know how troubled the Superman license was in the 90s. How they kept trying to make, and there was just terrible studio interference with all the screenplays, and none of them went anywhere. And they were going to cast fucking Nick Cage was going to be Superman. It's terrible.
And that movie was this close to being made. That's the astonishing thing. They almost made that movie.
They were taking makeup test shots
Yeah,
of Nick Cage. Yeah,
yeah.
it's amazing. It's amazing. But yeah, but yeah. So I don't have a whole lot more to say about Superman. So do you want to? Because we were talking before we started the hangout that we might talk about Last Jedi a bit.
Yeah, I would love to, because I know you said you mentioned that you have some problems with it, but they're not the problems that have gotten most of the attention, the sort of crybaby
Yeah,
problems.
there's a lot of YouTube videos of people like declaring Star Wars is dead, all
Oh
this
yeah.
stupid nonsense about that. I don't think that's true at all. And like the whole MRA stuff, like that's not my issue at all. Like,
Yeah.
most people are idiots who don't know anything about the film industry, and they don't know anything about storytelling or anything like that.
Yeah, I was going to say they don't know anything about movies, period, even as critics
Yeah.
or fans. It's just
No,
like,
God, no.
what do you expect to see in a movie? What would make you happy exactly?
Yeah, these are people who are judging the quality of movies based on how reactionary the politics in the movies are. Like, so that's their yardstick. And that's not me at all. So I thought it was interesting though, because the directors that they've chosen for these Star Wars films, like I haven't been a big fan of. I went into Rogue One thinking I was going to hate it, because the guy who made that is a director who I actively like hate. That guy,
Yeah.
And I don't hate him as a person. I hate what his career trajectory represents, because, like in the MCU video that I'm writing, I talk about how Jon Favreau's directorial career represents a real sort of traditional directorial trajectory. Basically, the budget, each film, the budget's bigger than the one before, like double it. They like basically double or more as they go up, and it's real traditional, like testing him out, testing the waters of what budget level he can work at.
Right.
Whereas the guy who did Rogue One, his career trajectory was I should actually know what his name is if I'm going to talk about him. I should look that up. But yeah, so his career trajectory was that he did a movie called Monsters for $500,000. And I didn't like that movie. I thought the fact that he was lauded for making it, I didn't understand that. It was mostly outside of the film industry that lauded him for that. I don't get it. That movie was quite boring to me. It was mainly good for its visual effects, which isn't a great reason to choose a director. But anyway, then they gave him the bloody Godzilla remake. And that was like an $80 million movie. I'm going to look up the budget for it. So
yeah, it was a pretty big movie. It was especially for a Godzilla movie.
Yeah, so it was a double 80. It was $160 million. So he went from $500,000 to $160 million. Now, that is absolutely insane to me. It doesn't make any sense. And as a result, that movie wasn't very good, So I know a lot of people disagree, and they like the fan service stuff in it with the atomic breath and all that. But to me, there was just a lot of plot holes in it. There was a lot of stuff that didn't really make sense if you thought about it. They underused a lot of the actors heavily. Ken Watanabe and Bryan Cranston should not have been in the movie. Like, they barely used them. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, especially Cranston. He looked like he was going to be the protagonist, and then he's gone. Halfway through it.
So yeah, Gareth Edwards, that's the guy. So yeah, I went into Rogue One thinking, oh, here we go again. I'm going to hate this fucking thing. And then I actually really liked it. I mean, I don't think it was good because of his work on it. I think it was mainly the screenplay, which is why it was as good as it was. But because the screenplay was really tight in that film. And, but he didn't bungle it. He didn't screw it up. He at least did his job. So, I've had a bit of a turnaround on my opinion of that dude. But, so I went into Rogue One thinking I was going to hate it, and I really liked it. And I went into Last Jedi thinking I was going to like it, because I haven't been a huge fan of Rian Johnson's movies, but he did the best ever episode of Breaking Bad. What's it called? Ozymandias, the third to last episode of Breaking Bad, which is the best episode of Breaking Bad. And so I thought, I have a decent amount of respect for him. So I went in thinking I'm going to dig this. And also I'd seen the title of Dan Olsen's vlog. It made me feel feelings. So I was like, all right, I'm going to feel things. This is going to be great. And I didn't feel anything. Like, I wanted to like it, but it didn't grab me. And I think part of the reason for that is because Force Awakens, like I said, was a retelling of, it was basically a New Hope again, in its structure and its style and all that. And I thought, if they better not do that with Empire Strikes Back, because there's no way they can match Empire Strikes Back. Empire Strikes Back is a masterpiece. Yeah. Everything went right on that movie. It was like everything fell into place perfectly. It was just this brilliant thing, and they can't match it, so they shouldn't try. They should try and do something totally different, and they didn't. They basically just did Empire Strikes Back. So, you know, I mean, it didn't end on a total downer or anything. Without spoilers, I shouldn't say too much, but it wasn't a mirror it wasn't a perfect mirror like it was with A New Hope, like Force Awakens was with A New Hope, but it was a pretty typical middle movie in a trilogy kind of movie, basically.
I'll agree with that. Yeah. I'll agree with that.
And I wanted them to do something really brave and different and really outside the box. And like, that's why I was kind of glad that they'd hired Rian Johnson, because as much as I wasn't a big fan of Brick or Looper, you could at least say these are not standard movies. These are so he's doing something a bit different in each of those movies. And so, you know, I kind of was hoping that they'd do something really outlandish and weird and like brave and bold, but they just didn't really. And so I figure, though, I will probably like it more on my second viewing when I don't have all those expectations in my head and I can just watch it for what it is. I'm not going to love it. I'm pretty sure of that, but I probably won't dislike it as much on my second viewing.
I know that. I mean, I think maybe it's a little bit like the phenomenon I was describing earlier in regards to Star Trek, where I agree with you. It's not, if you judge it just as a movie, it's not really a groundbreaking, bold new thing. It's fairly conventional. But there are a lot of sort of departures in it from Star Wars movies. And of course, I mean, that's not necessarily, I mean, there were departures in Rogue One as well, and you really like that one. So that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's just, you know, but I think when people say like, oh, it's, you know, it's the franchise moving in a bold new direction, it's not bold compared to movies in general, but it's bold, relatively speaking, in terms of Star Wars, because it contains a lot of very overt political commentary, which isn't something Star Wars usually does, especially in like an episode, you know, like a mainline, you know, film. Rogue One, I guess you would have to call sort of a spin-off or kind of a side project. But, you know, for the main trilogy, you know, there's a lot of political stuff in it. And that's something that Star Wars has generally shied away from, at least in that way. You can always read you can take a political reading of it, but
the original trilogy was kind of like anti-fascist movies, but they were made at a time where like fascism wasn't a big, like it wasn't like commenting on contemporary political events or anything like that. It was more general and vague. Whereas, I get what you mean. Whereas Last Jedi was more like, this is what's happening in the world today. Kind of like Battlestar Galactica did, with its anti-Iraq war stuff. Yeah,
exactly. And it's hard to miss. Like, you can watch the original trilogy and not read it in terms of an anti-fascist allegory. And you don't even have to call it an allegory. I mean, the Empire is actually a fascist state. But I mean, you can view it in another way, and you don't necessarily get that. But especially with the Canto Bight stuff in Last Jedi, like, it's obviously that the storytellers are trying to make a point, and that's something that is relatively unheard of in the Star Wars movie. And, you know, like the Benicio del Toro character winding up being like a truly amoral character. He doesn't turn out to be a scoundrel with a heart of gold. He turns out to he will just go where the money goes. That's kind of that's the character that we haven't really seen in Star Wars before. So I think it's a relative thing. It's nothing terribly inventive or creative in terms of filmmaking, but for Star Wars, it's like they're pulling in different tropes that Star Wars has not really featured before. And I think a lot of that, people maybe they give it too much credit for that, you know, where they should be saying, well, why don't we expect, you know, why do we give it so much credit for coloring just this much outside the lines when it's not really that big of a deal? But
I think one thing I did really appreciate about it was that, you know, they looked at the sort of reactionary view of the Force Awakens and thought, you know what? You hated that? Have a lot fucking more of the same fucking thing, you assholes. So that was cool.
And then the satisfying part, as far as that goes, is this movie also made all the money in the world. So, you know, I mean, and you can chalk it up to say, well, it's Star Wars, you know what I mean? It's of course it's going to make a ton of money, but it establishes that, you know, you can do a movie where it does have an ethnically diverse cast, and it does have, a much higher representation of women and important characters, and not be apologetic about it, and be very sort of upfront about it. And it will still, if it's a good movie, or if it's part of a franchise that people are invested in, that it will not affect, the performance of it.
A couple of things about that. So Star Wars, like you said, they're always going to make a bunch of money, but that makes them the ideal movie to do that kind of thing in.
I agree.
You don't have to, it's not a risk so much. And the other thing I liked about it is that they didn't there was never a thing in either A Force Awakens or The Last Jedi where they were like, raise a woman and that's important. She just is. She's just, right. It's not a big deal. She just is. And like, compare that to a lot of other sort of movies because there was a really interesting thing when I went to see the Shape of Water, which is another film with a female protagonist. That movie doesn't necessarily, in fact, that kind of movie kind of does a bit of slight amount of history revisionism, a little bit, in terms of like, actually the women in the workplace probably would have had a bit of a rougher time than they did, because it's set in the early 60s. But it was still like it was like a big deal that she was a woman. And then and when I went to see that film, the 3 trailers that were played before the movie all had female protagonists in them. So I thought that was really cool. There was the Japanese anime with the girl who goes to a witch's school. I can't remember what that's called. And there was The Post, and then there was what's it called? She's got like a name of a flower or something. Oh, I can't. It's Saoirse Ronan who's in that. So I'll look that up because I actually want to see that movie definitely. Where is it? Lady Bird. That's it.
Oh,
Lady
yeah,
Bird.
I want to see that too. Yeah, I haven't seen that yet.
So there was Lady Bird, The Post, and that Japanese anime with the witch school. So, and I thought that was really cool. But in all of those movies, it was a big deal that she was a female. Like they made a big deal out of it. And in The Post, I get that. That you can't really avoid that. Because it was literally a big deal that a woman was running the Washington Post and was responsible for all that stuff. And so but in the trailer they milk the hell out of it. It was a little bit overwhelming. And then so I just thought it was cool that Star Wars didn't do that, and they're well positioned to not do that, because in a science fiction universe, you don't have to make a big deal of it. In fact, if you do, it's kind of like, whoa, you're anchoring this through the real world a little bit too much,
Right.
Like in Battlestar Galactica, where they just call everyone sir, they're like in the military, and there's a lot of gender equality in the military and all that kind of stuff, because that is the best genre to do that in, where you're not going to like do any history revisionism, and you're not going to like make people go, huh? When you do it, it just works, So I liked that. And like I said, I'll probably enjoy it on my second viewing more, where I'm not going in with the expectations that I went in with the first film.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, I as I said in my review video I made of it, I mean, I really liked it. I'm sort of, I guess I'm a little bit like relative to Star Wars, I'm a little bit like you described yourself being towards Star Trek at the beginning of the Hangout, where I mean, obviously I really like Star Wars, and I've been to see, since I've been old enough, I've been to see all of the movies in the theater, except for episode 3, because I swore off after episode 2. I said I'm not going to see the next one. But I mean, I really like it. I don't like it. I like the movies. Like, I've never been into the comics or the books. I've never watched the TV series. Like, I've never watched Rebels or Clone Wars or anything. But as far as the movies, I've always been right there, and I've really enjoyed them for the most part. But I don't consider myself like a Star Wars guy. If you say which do I prefer, it's like Star Trek without even having to think about it.
Right.
And I identify a lot more closely with that than I do with Star Wars. So when I see The Last Jedi, I think like, oh, that's really great, but I don't feel as invested in it as I would if they released a Star Trek movie that made $500 million and was, like at the top of critics lists and getting Oscar nominations. I'd be like, yes,
Yeah. I guess, for me, like I am a big Star Wars person, but I'm more into the expanded universe, what they used to call the expanded universe. Whereas like, I have an embarrassingly large collection of Dark Horse Star Wars comics, and like a huge fan of the Darth Bane novel trilogy, and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic is my favorite video game of all time. Like, so like I don't feel as invested in the movies, because the movies have always been a bit more mass appeal kind of thing. Like with the comics and the games and stuff, they can do things that are a little bit more like niche and a little bit more interesting. Like for example, in one of the Star Wars comics, they've got a guy Quinlan Vos, who's like a spy who goes to the dark side to spy on the Darksiders, but he actually he starts falling for real, and he's trying to stay out, but he's it's like that whole thing they always do in undercover cop movies, but with the added thing of the Force, with the dark side of the Force. So it's like really cool and powerful and stuff. So I've been but it did affect my viewing of The Last Jedi, because there was a few things I did with Force powers in there. I'm like, that's not an established use of the Force. Bullshit. Because whenever somebody does something new with the Force, it always annoys me. Like in one of the Legacy of the Force novels, they have a character time traveling, and I'm like, no.
Oh yeah.
No. You can't use the Force to fucking time travel. Fuck off, kind of thing. So I was a little bit annoyed by some of the stuff they did with the Force powers in that as well. But I mean, that wasn't enough to if that had been the only thing, I still would have liked it. If it's that wouldn't have been enough. I'm not that much of a Star Wars geek that I like the really technical stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't let that.
I know. I'm not that way either. I'm glad that that's my attitude, because I'm sure I would have denied myself many hours of enjoyment if I got hung up on the way I approach it, as when I'm acting as a critic and also when I'm just being a fan and watching a movie, is every movie has plot holes, every movie has conceits, every movie has cheats to get from point A to point B. But if the movie's good enough, you don't care. And if the movie's or you don't notice while you're watching it, it's like what TV tropes calls fridge logic. It comes to you much later.
That's the thing, is that when you can make it through the movie without noticing these things, and then someone points it out to you later, and you go, oh yeah, but the classic one that everyone uses in the film industry is Jurassic Park. Where the hell did the T-Rex come from?
Right.
It must have smashed through the wall, but there's that, but nobody notices that while they're watching the movie, because the pacing is so tight, everything is so exciting that you don't even pick up on that. So yeah, that I agree with that. That's not a big deal either.
Yeah, and I think if everybody has their own taste and everybody has their own reasons for liking or not liking a movie, and if you had liked The Last Jedi more than you did, then the Force power stuff would have bothered you even less. You know what I mean? Maybe you wouldn't even have thought about it. Because I remember when the first the first Spider-Man movie came out, and I ran into a guy that was an acquaintance of a friend of mine. I didn't really know him that well, but he was like a big comic book guy. And I ran into him at Walmart one day. And so of course I was like, hey, did you see Spider-Man? Because, I loved it. I thought it was great. And it was it was a big hit. And I said, did you see Spider-Man? Thinking, oh, this guy is going to be all over Spider-Man, right? And he says, yeah, and clearly he was very disappointed in it. I said, you didn't like it? And he said, well, it was all right. It was all right until this. And he starts doing the web shooter thing. And I knew exactly what he was talking about, because in the movies, in the Sam Raimi movies with Tobey Maguire, his web shooters are part of his body. They're not mechanical.
Yeah, it kind of comes out of his,
it comes out of his wrist.
The comics haven't been doing that for a long time.
Yeah, the comics, he has mechanical web shooters. And and they did that. Sam Raimi did that, he said, because it allowed them to skip a step. Instead of trying to explain why this kid was able to create this amazing technology, they just said, the hell with it. It's just part of his powers. It's just, he got bit by a spider. Now he can do that. So let's just move on. And it was a departure from the character in the comics, but he felt like he had a good reason to do it. And to me, I don't even notice. Like when I watch those Spider-Man movies, it doesn't bother me at all. It's not this is good, but I don't know, the web shooter thing. I don't care.
I've actually got a video in the works sometime in the near future about that as well. Because
cool.
So Spider-Man 2 is the one I'm going to be talking about, not the first one.
Okay.
Spider-Man 2 is it's the best movie that has been made that has Spider-Man in the title, but that's not the best Spider-Man movie. As a film, just taken on its own merits, it's a great movie. It's got everything a big Hollywood movie should have. It's really exciting. It's really spectacular. It's got a lot of spectacle. It's fun, but it's really not that faithful to the actual character. If you look at the way that the character is in the comics, the way he talks all the time during fights, and the way he acts in this sort of really sort of offhand way, this really light, sort of almost dismissive of the villains, kind of really arrogant kind of way. And he's like a kid. essentially. But the characters in that and the Amazing Spider-Man, they didn't really feel faithful at all. And so like the video is going to be about how in Homecoming, they actually really tried to make the character. They really wanted to be faithful. So he does all the things that you expect from the actual character Spider-Man. So even though it's not as good as of a movie as Spider-Man 2 is, it's still more faithful. And therefore, from a comic fan, like I'm not actually a big fan of Spider-Man. I'm a huge Marvel nerd, like, but he's not like, for me, Spider-Man's the kind of character that works best when he like appears in someone else's series to be like the sidekick. That's where like him and Deadpool have a lot of fun interactions and stuff because they're sort of similar characters in some ways. Like there's a great bit in Cable and Deadpool where he's fighting venom creatures. Venom aliens have attached themselves to time-traveling dinosaurs and are ransacking Manhattan. There's venom dinosaurs running down the streets of Manhattan, and so he teams up with Spider-Man to stop them and stuff. And like they have this great interplay and stuff like that. So I like Spider-Man in that role, but I've never been a big fan of the actual Spider-Man comics. But as a comic book fan, I always appreciate it when they go out of their way to try and be faithful, because there's a lot of comic book movies where they just don't even care. They're just like, it's a property that some nerds know about, so we'll make a bit of money out of it. Fuck it, And I like it when they actually show respect, and that's what Homecoming really was all about to me. It was really, it's time to actually respect this character and do him properly,
Yeah.
So yeah. That's what I liked about it.
I agree. I think Homecoming was sort of Marvel's way of reassuring the fans that okay, we're really gonna do this right, because I think the Sam Raimi series, except there are a lot of people that don't like Spider-Man 3, but the first two for the most part are pretty well regarded. But the Amazing Spider-Man and the Amazing Spider-Man 2 are kind of looked kind of sideways, like, oh, what was the deal with that? And then so after that is when Marvel Studios gets the property back, and now they're sort of like, okay, but no, don't worry, I know we're gonna reboot it again, sorry, but we're really gonna do it right this time.
Exactly. Yeah, so they kind of had to, in a way, to do the faithful version this time. You're right. But I think Spider-Man 3, I think they basically just let them do whatever they want with it, and they probably would have done with a bit more studio oversight, to be honest with you.
I think actually the only thing about Spider-Man 3 that I've ever heard, I don't know a lot about it, but I know that the studio really pushed for Venom to be in it.
Sam Raimi doesn't like.
Raimi wanted to do a Sandman movie because Raimi's more attracted to sort of the classic rogues gallery from the 60s,
the Silver Age.
And they said, no, we want to do Venom. So he said, okay, we'll do both. And it feels a little stuffed. It's like, do we really need Sandman and Venom in this movie?
And the Sandman stuff was actually really cool. Like the Sandman, although the whole retroactively making him the guy that was dumb as
that's
hell.
A little, it's kind of a clumsy retcon.
But aside from that, like it was like you felt for the guy. He was a sympathetic villain, and also the visual effects were cutting edge as hell. So that was cool.
And the frustrating thing to me about Spider-Man 3 is, it is ungainly. It is way too long. There are something it tries to do too much, because not only does it have the Sandman story, it also has Venom. It also has Harry turning evil and becoming the Goblin again. So it's like, God, there's a lot going on here. You could do 3 movies with this stuff, and you're cramming it into one. And then like Peter and Mary Jane break up, and they do the Spider-Man has the symbiote first, and they do the black costume stuff, and then it goes to Eddie and becomes Venom. It's like, wow, there's a lot. They're blowing through years worth of comics in this movie.
One of my industry colleagues made an interesting point about Spider-Man 3. He said, for me, it wasn't the whole dancing thing that was the big problem. The big problem was that they did the same thing, the same subplot 3 movies in a row, which is there's a part in the middle of the movie where Spider-Man is overwhelmed with self-doubt. Because he loses his powers, or because he gets defeated or something. There's a bit in every one of those movies where he has this whole thing where he's full of self-doubt, and he basically isn't a superhero for a while. And it's like, dude, can you really do the same subplot 3 times in a row? Like, Jesus. And I get that. That was a bit.
I think that they had they did that a little bit with Batman too, in the Burton Schumacher movies, especially in Batman Forever. There's like this scene where he just decides he's not going to be Batman anymore, and you don't buy it for a second, because it's like
No.
it's with there's 20 minutes left in the movie, and he's like, I'm giving up. I'm not going to be Batman anymore. And then you're like, okay, come on though, but for real, and he's not Batman for about 5 minutes, and then he's back to being Batman.
They did that in the Dark Knight trilogy as well with the ending, and like that strikes me as a basic misunderstanding of what the character is, because to me, like, to be Batman is a guy who's pathologically determined to be Batman. Like, he puts on the mask when he's Bruce Wayne, like that. So, but what you're saying there is, I'm going to wear the mask for the rest of my life. No, that's like, you want to be who you really are, and who he really is Batman. So like, it strikes me as a misunderstanding. Really is
the thing about, as far as that goes, and with the last Christopher Nolan Batman movie, Dark Knight Rises, I think the problem.
Hated,
See, I didn't hate it. I thought I look at it a lot like Spider-Man 3. I think it has moments of just shining brilliance. They're just lost, and there's just so much. There's just so much there that doesn't need to be there.
I hate it for a very specific reason, which is that I'm a huge fan of Nightwing, Dick Grayson. Like, he's one of my I think I regard Batman as kind of like an authoritarian character, so I don't really like Batman that much. But like Nightwing and like Batgirl is my favorite DC character ever. Like, I love Batgirl, because Batgirl is Batman without the money. So she has to do everything. She has to use her brain, and she's really smart. She's I think she does geometry at university and stuff. So she's like really, really smart, and she uses her knowledge of geometry to make the rope thing that she uses to swing around, and she uses like particular like angles and stuff. She thinks, and when she's like in her thought bubble, she's like thinking about angular momentum a lot and stuff. So she's like Batman, but on a budget and with a lot more brains. Like, so she's like a really interesting character. And I feel the same way about Nightwing. I really like Nightwing. And the whole approach they took to the whole Robin thing, and that, where it's like, you should use your birth name, Robin. It's like, really, movie, really. Sure, no respect at all for that character. God damn it.
I would love. I put up a video a couple days ago about Batman, and I mentioned just in passing that I'm of the opinion, as a lifelong Batman fan, that if Batman doesn't have Robin, it's not really Batman. And that's, even though I've really enjoyed some of the Batman movies, especially The Dark Knight, I thought it was fantastic, way better than I ever thought a Batman movie would be. But they've never done Robin in a Batman movie, and they did it in Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, but he was basically Nightwing there, and he was grown up, like he wasn't a teenager. And they were 3 movies in before they introduced him. And I just thought, I can't fathom doing Batman without Robin. It's just a central part of the character. It's like doing Batman without Alfred, or without Commissioner Gordon. Like, he's got to be there.
And that's what I mean about the filmmakers not really getting it, because they all approach it like, Robin really going to do that cheesy shit. It's like, no, you don't understand. Like, okay. Dark Victory is one of my favorite ever Batman.
I love that. Yeah.
I love Dark Victory so much. It's so good. And I love the whole what I don't know if this is a thing that, like, a term that's used, but I like have this thing where I call the first 4 years of the, so when the Batman was rebooted in the late 80s, where they did Batman Year One, and then after that there was like a period where a lot of writers would come in and do an early Batman story that took place somewhere in the first 4 years of his existence, right? And so Dark Victory was in that. There's Robin Year One, Batgirl Year One, of course, Long Halloween. There was Matt Wagner came in and did a bunch of comics. He did Batman and the Monster Man, and Batman and was that the Dracula thing that he did? So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that, and I love that era, that late 80s, early 90s, and this continued into like the 2000s as well, of the early Batman, where he's sort of still figuring out how he's doing things, and when Robin comes into that, you're right, that is the moment where it's like everything's complete now, they have that dynamic between the two of them.
It's just, and I mean, the people, it's funny because that's always the excuse is, well, Robin's too silly. It's Batman. Like, I mean, even if you do it really dark and try to do it dark and serious, like, you can't get away from how silly it is. It's always a guy dressed in a costume, fighting bad guys. Like, you can't get away from that, no matter how serious you try to take it. And so to me, that's just an admission of, well, look, we just have no idea how to do this.
Exactly.
I would love to see a filmmaker with a unique take on the character, come up with a Batman movie that is faithful to what came before and is a good rendering of the sort of generic Batman that we all know, but it, incorporates Robin. And I would love to see Nightwing too, because I'm a huge fan of Nightwing. When I first was getting into Batman comics and I learned about Nightwing, and it's like, oh, it's Robin who grew up, and he went out and did his own thing. It's like, wow, that's so cool. There's like a grown up Robin, and he's still doing stuff. And I love that character. And
my favorite Batman movie is one of the animated movies. It's the Under the Red Hood.
Oh, okay, yeah, I have that one.
Yeah. Where it's they show
good in that.
Yeah, Nightwing's in that, but that's more about the second Robin, and they have this really cool flashback sequence where it shows how acrobatic Robin is, and that's how he's able to fight so well, because he basically does acrobatics all over the bed. And these bad guys are like, hood gangsters. They've never seen anything like it. This guy like jumping around through the air and kicking them in the head and stuff. They don't know how to deal with it, so they just get trounced, and it makes it believable. And so to me, actually, Robin is one of the least cheesy things about Batman, because the first Robin is a scarred character. He's a broken character. He's damaged. He's just watched his family get murdered by penguins, gangsters, and he's a really damaged person who relates to Batman because Batman's also a damaged character, and they have this really interesting dynamic and stuff. So it's like, and then they move on to the second Robin, who things get really dark there, obviously, with what happens with him and Joker, and then the third Robin, he meets him when he's stealing the wheels off the Batmobile. Like, how cool is that? Like, just a bunch of I think it's one of the cooler things about Batman. But the filmmakers just don't really know how to do it. You're right.
Well, and the other thing I like about Robin that you can apply to whichever Robin you're talking about. When I think about Batman as a writer or as a critic, even, I have a very judgmental view of Batman. Like, I love him, but I take a very, if you imagine Batman as a real person, Batman should not be doing this.
No,
what Batman does is bad. What Batman does is wrong. He fights.
It's a real indictment of wealth inequality and things like that, where this billionaire can just do whatever the fuck he wants.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you can't get he has to be Batman because that's the premise. And, he fights people who are evil people. And, depending on who the writer is, he saves the city, he saves the world, he does all these good things. But fundamentally, he has no right to do any of that. Like, it's not his place to just put on a suit and go out and beat people up and take the law into his own hands. And it's just, what he does is wrong. So when you look at it that way, and you look at Robin and you think, oh my God, how dare this guy bring a child into this warped, horrible lifestyle that he leads, and bring his child into this work, and that is just, to me, that's just fascinating. That really puts a magnifying glass on the character, and you can approach it in a really challenging way, where you can still write the sort of adventure stories that you have to have for Batman, so it doesn't get too heavy. But when you want to examine the character and deconstruct it a little, you have like, oh my God, what a blind spot this guy has, where not only he is doing this on his own, but he's bringing a grieving, wounded child into this life and making him into another version of himself. Like, it's just awful when you think about it like that.
And the way Dark Victory handles that, though, is really good. They handle it really well, because it's not Batman that's pushing it; it's Robin that's pushing it. Like, Batman doesn't even want to actually talk to him much. Batman is so preoccupied with what he's got going on that the blind spot becomes he's not paying enough attention to Dick Grayson. And so Dick Grayson doesn't have any parent, basically. He doesn't have any guardianship. Alfred kind of takes the role, but Alfred's really busy as well. So Robin basically just starts going out and beating up crims and stuff. Like, Robin wants to take revenge on Penguin's goons and stuff. So, it's actually the other way around. Batman is trying to prevent him from doing it. And it's only when he realizes that actually this kid can handle himself. This kid's actually quite capable. He doesn't really need me to worry about whether he's going to get himself killed or not, because he's actually really capable. And then you got the interesting thing with Robin kind of bringing Batgirl into it a bit later.
Yeah, I know that. I really love Dark Victory too. I love that the creative team behind that, Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, are probably my favorite Batman creative team, because the way they do the character is sort of a middle ground between like the super dark Frank Miller version and like the sort
The
of the
sort of
more
proto-fascist.
yeah. Well, yeah, with Miller, it's like you can't get away from it. It's like, oh my God, is this guy's the good guy?
Yeah.
But so they're not nearly so far over in that direction, but they're darker than, say, like the Silver Age stuff, or the,
Yeah.
like the Denny O'Neil 70s era stuff, which was going in sort of a darker direction, but was still very light, very adventure oriented. So I think they strike a nice balance in terms of Sale's visual style and in terms of Loeb's writing in those stories. So that's one of my favorite versions of Batman, is that the Long Halloween Dark Victory version.
I think maybe for me, like, Long Halloween was too hyped. Like, I'd heard so much about it by the time I read it that I was like, this is the comic that everyone says is the greatest Batman comic. But then I read the sequel to it. I was like, this is the greatest Batman comic. This is when they've really sort of figured things out. And so I prefer it to Long Halloween personally. I do like what they did with Catwoman in Long Halloween. How she's kind of like, that's when there's a really delicate thing with is she an ally of Batman? Is she a villain? Like, what has she got going on and stuff? That was really cool. And then she went off and did her. Have you read Catwoman When in Rome? When she does that's her first chronologically canonically first solo outing, and that's like a really interesting, getting kind of played and manipulated and stuff, but she comes out on top. That's really cool.
Yeah, and Darwin Cook did a really good Catwoman story called Selena's Big Score.
Yeah, that's probably the best.
That is
that's
really
like
good.
The best. That's the best Catwoman comic ever, I think.
Yeah, it's really, really good. Darwin Cook was another guy who's just a genius, and I loved every Batman thing he ever did. But yeah, I mean, there's I remember the point I wanted to make about Dark Knight Rises, which was, because I'm part of my philosophy, I guess, part of the way I approach things is I'm very willing to accept a premise just to see where it goes, because like my personal take on Batman lines up with a lot of what you said, where I can't think of a reason why he would ever stop being Batman voluntarily. I just think he, like you said, he's pathological. Like he just would keep doing it as long as he could. And in Dark Knight Rises, they sort of said, well, they hinted that, well, one of the reasons he stopped was that he was hurt. He walked on a cane at the beginning of the movie, and it's like, well, he can't physically do it anymore, which, okay, I guess, he fell at the end of the Dark Knight. Maybe he messed his leg up worse than we thought. Okay. But then when he decides to start being Batman again, it takes like 10 minutes. Like he puts like a thing on his leg and he's like, okay, I'm good. So it's like, so this was the reason. Like I
was just thinking they kind of undercut the whole he hurt his leg thing with the way they ended the Dark Knight, where he's on the bat cycle. It's like, I don't know that much about motorbikes, but I don't think you're actually able to operate a motorbike if you can't use one of your legs. Like,
he seems like he's doing okay. Yeah. I mean, but I mean, like with Dark Knight Rises, it was, there were parts of it that I really liked. There were parts of it that it just like, it was a Spider-Man 3 thing where it's like, God, there's just so much here. It feels like they could have made some a little bit tougher narrative choices and whittled this down to a 2-hour movie, and it would have been fantastic. But they wanted to do. Yeah, go ahead.
Kevin Smith did a podcast. I don't actually like Kevin Smith as a director very much, and I think even he doesn't like Kevin Smith as a director very much.
No, he doesn't.
He's one of those. So in the early '90s indie scene, the Sundance Kids, there was some of them that were really good at screenwriting, but really actually weren't very good at directing, and they probably just sort of stayed as screenwriters. And he's like one of them to me. Like he's really good at writing dialogue, really snappy, funny dialogue. But as a director, he just doesn't really know what he's doing very much. But he has sometimes, like, okay, there are major exceptions to this. For example, like he went to the set of the first Star Wars prequel, and he was like, "This is gonna be great." It's like, no, dude, you were so wrong. So like, he kind of lost a lot of credibility there. But he did this hour-and-a-half long, I think it was, like 90-minute long podcast about all the plot holes in Dark Knight Rises. And if you sit through that, you're like, holy shit, he just destroys the entire movie. Like,
there are a ton. Yeah, there are a ton.
He's like, you can't look at the movie the same way again after you watch that or listen to that.
And I mean, like I say, it wouldn't be that big of a deal if it were a better movie, and if it weren't such a long movie, and if it weren't such.
Because the thing about that podcast is that he didn't like wait till the movie came out on Blu-ray and then study it a bunch of times. That was after he'd seen the movie once.
Right. And it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, he sat there and talked about plot holes for 90 minutes. Like, it's not, he shouldn't be able to do that.
So the police were trapped in the sewers the whole time? You know,
what happened to their guns?
How did he get back on the island when we've established that you can't get back onto the island? Like, just kind of pops back up like, hey, I'm Batman. I got back. What? Like, that wasn't, you couldn't come up with a cool action scene to explain how, you know, he couldn't sneak. That's, I mean, it doesn't bother me that much because there's other things in the movie that I had more problems with. That the fact that he got back to Gotham inexplicably doesn't really bother me that much.
That wasn't really one of the things that I was thinking about when I mentioned that.
I mean, the only thing that bothers me about it is I feel like it was a missed opportunity. I feel like, you know, they build up like, oh, nobody's getting across the bridge, nobody can get into the city, and it's like, okay, so that could be like that's going to be a great scene. How does Batman get back into the city? And then they just skip it. It's like, damn, that could have been a great scene, and they just didn't do anything. They just completely hand waved it and said, oh, he's back, he's Batman, he figured it out. Okay.
From a behind the scenes view on that, so the basic thing there was that Nolan did Batman Begins because it was his. So there's a thing in Hollywood called the A-list, where the directors who, no matter what the budget of the movie is, they always have final cut. That's the thing. And in order to get into that, you have to make a series of successful big budget movies. So so Batman Begins was him like, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make sure I always have creative control of my films, no matter what. And so that was his sort of foot in the door on that. After he did that, he was like, okay, he's not quite in the A-list yet, but he'd done well with that. And he was working for a guy called Thomas Tull, who Legendary Pictures, who's a really interesting producer and stuff. He basically let Nolan do whatever he wanted to do with Dark Knight. Yeah. And so Nolan was like, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to make the movie Heat, but with a psychotic clown running around. That is basically, he literally said that in an issue of Empire that I read. He said, it's Heat, but with a psychotic clown. And so I was like, okay, this sounds fucking awesome. Like, and that is what the movie is. Like, he really delivered on that. And so it's got some really interesting ideas, but it's so good and so interesting that he didn't know what the hell to do after that.
Yeah.
And he didn't really want to do a third film, but he got pressured into it. And he was like, if you do this and it makes a bunch of money, you'll be in. You won't have to ever worry again about having final cut. And so he was like, all right, fuck it, I'll do it. He didn't, his heart wasn't in it in the same way. It's just the same as Peter Jackson and The Hobbit. Peter Jackson made the Hobbit movies for industry reasons relating to paying his workers and stuff. He wasn't making it because he wanted to make a great movie. That's why he made 3 movies, because it gives 4 years of work to the Wellington film industry rather than one, sort of thing. And so he was doing it for all the wrong reasons. Although, you know, from the point of view of someone who knows people who were able to feed their kids because of those movies, like, I can't hate him for it.
Right. Exactly.
At the same time, you know, he did butcher The Hobbit, like, and, you know, Del Toro walked away from it because he was like, okay, this is not going to be good. Right. And, you know, so it's like that. Some directors, they need to have passion in order to make it work, and Nolan just, his heart wasn't in that, you know, and you could tell.
Yeah, you could tell. I mean, there was a lot of easy passes in The Dark Knight Rises where they did things just because they got to a certain point in the story and they just said, okay, and then he does this there, you know, instead of being really creative with it. Like, there was the, you know, what I was saying earlier about how they could have had a really cool scene to explain how Batman gets back into Gotham that they just kind of blew off. And then the one that really bothered me the most was they do the second fight between Batman and Bane, and Batman just wins that time. Like, there's not, he doesn't seem to approach it any differently. You know, it's not like he's learned from the last fight. It's not like the Rocky movie where Rocky, he lost, but he figured out how to beat him, you know, and then the second fight, it's a little different. You see his strategy pays off. It's in Dark Knight Rises. It's like, well, Batman's back and his back is better, and he just fights Bane again. And this time he wins. And it just doesn't feel satisfying because you don't feel like Batman really learned anything. You don't feel like he outsmarted him.
Yeah, it's also not very Batman, because like the thing about Batman is
Yeah.
that Batman will always win if he has enough time to prepare. That's the thing. He can beat anybody at all, even Superman, if he has enough time to think about how he's going to approach it and plan ahead. But in that movie, he just uses his fists. You know, he doesn't think about. There's no fun trick he pulls on him. No like thing he'd planted in advance or some plan he'd come up with. He just punches him better than he did the first time. You know?
Exactly.
Like
His plan is to come back and fight him again. Like that's
exactly.
That's
yeah.
Plan. He killed you last time.
And you know, you could see that in the way that in the Dark Knight Returns he manages to defeat Superman because he builds the suit and uses kryptonite and all that stuff. Whereas there's a Marvel and DC crossover that they did where Batroc the Leaper, who's like a mid tier at best Marvel villain, like at the peak of his career he was mid tier at most, and he comes in and I don't know if you've read it, but he beats the crap out of Batman. Just lays him out because he surprises Batman. Batman doesn't have any time to plan or prepare. Right. He just gets his ass handed to him by like a random Marvel character. And that's why. It's because Batman thrives with planning and preparation.
Yeah.
And of course, the money helps with that. You know,
the money is a big part of it. Yeah.
There's a limit to how much you plan and prepare if you're on a budget. So yeah.
Yeah. And you know, in a way, maybe that was the downfall of Dark Knight Rises, was they had a movie that they knew people would come to see. They knew they would have a big budget. They knew they had their cast, and they knew that they had a few really big emotional beats they were going to hit. And they figured, well, this will be enough. And I mean, it wasn't. Like I think it seems like I liked it more than you did. You said you hated it, but it's certainly a letdown. It's certainly a big letdown. I hated
the way they handled Robin.
Yeah,
that's the part I really hated. Yeah.
Although I will say, even though I don't like the way they handled Robin, and I don't like making that character Robin. Like I just feel like that's like
it was a shoehorn.
It's it feels
shoehorned in for no fucking reason. Yeah.
But I like the idea of Batman having a successor at the end of the movie, and
sure.
I love even though it's some people don't like it because they feel it's kind of corny and it's too literal, because I love the final shot, because the final shot is John in the Batcave and the floor starts to lift him up and then it cuts to black. So literally the new Dark Knight rises, and it's it's the title of the movie. And
that's the stuff that Nolan is always good at, though. Like that's with a guy like Nolan, that's the bare minimum you can expect to see in all of his films. They're always going to be, the visual language in the film is always going to be really tight.
Yeah.
Because that's what he's good at.
And it's like, but again, it takes me back to the missed opportunities, because it's like, to me, that final shot is such a brilliant shot. And it's such a brilliant way to end the movie and to sort of culminate a lot of the themes in the movie. And also do like a cheeky reference to the title. Yeah. And yet it's like, oh, that's genius. But how did Batman get back on the island? I don't know. Like, what was Batman's plan for defeating Bane? I don't know. He fights better. It's like, just can't you put that much thought into 2 or 3 other scenes in the movie? And boy, you really got something. But
yeah.
Well, yeah.
Anyway, we're 2 hours now, so it's probably a good time to.
I was just gonna say we've gone from Star Trek to Superman to Star Wars. Now we're in Batman, so we better wrap it up.
We went through Spider-Man as well.
Spider-Man? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. This was a lot of fun, though.
This was I loved this. This is great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, dude.
I was just gonna say thanks again for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, absolutely. Anytime you want to do something similar again, just let me know, because I thought this was a great talk. And obviously, we approach things in similar ways, but you have your own expertise and your own way of coming at things, and I have my own way of approaching it. So I think it's a really good.
You and I aren't ever going to be have angry screaming matches at each other over differing opinions or anything like that. We're close enough that we're going to be but at the same time, we've got slightly different angles on things, which is always good.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it reminds me of talking with movies with you, reminds me a little bit of talking with Jason, who I co-host the Late Seating podcast with, where we talk about movies, and because we have a very similar rapport, where we agree on most things, but when we disagree, even when we disagree significantly, it's never an issue, because I'm 37. I'm not going to fight
Yeah.
with people about movies. You know what I mean?
No,
like,
yeah.
like there's movies that I really love. There's movies that I really, really don't like. If we disagree on something like that, I just, you know what? It's a matter of taste. It's a matter of opinion. People are allowed to like what they like. I don't have to like it. I don't have to not like it. It is what it is. I'm way past the point of hating movies so bad that I fight about it.
I know enough about your taste in things where I know that like nothing like that will come up. For example, like, you know, we've talked about Magnolia before. Like Magnolia is my favorite film. And I know it's not your favorite film, but I know you like it. So you can appreciate you can appreciate what I like about it. So we're on the same like wavelength in that way, you know? So
yeah, I agree. Yeah. Oh man, we could do a hangout about Magnolia too, buddy. I mean, because I actually, you know what? I was flipping through channels the other day, and I caught probably about the last half hour of There Will Be Blood, and I just had to stop and watch it.
Yeah.
I couldn't turn past it. I was like, oh, I gotta watch. I don't care. Like, I have it on DVD. I can watch it whenever I want. I just had to watch it. So anyway, okay. Well, obviously, thanks for doing this with me. Thanks for being my guest. Thanks for an awesome conversation about Star Trek and Superman and a bunch of other stuff that we didn't plan on talking about, but we talked about it anyway. And thanks to all of you for watching. And if you enjoyed this, let me know that you liked it. Maybe me and Dan will do this again sometime. I certainly would be up for it.
Absolutely. I'd be up for that.
Yeah. And check out Dan's channel. Check out the Magic Theater. It's linked in the description of this video. Go check out his stuff. He does awesome videos. It's like what we've been talking about, only it's just him, so nobody interrupts him. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.